Welcome to the Massey Dialogues. Bienvenue au dialogue du Collège Massey. Massey College is a place for ideas. It's a place that has for mission to nourish learning and serve the public good, even in these difficult times. And I want to say on behalf of Massey College that we extend all our hearts and our minds to the victims and the families of the victims in Nova Scotia. Massey, the Collège Massey, the physical location of Massey is on a territory that have been cherished by Indigenous populations for a long time. The Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful for the ability to continue to do our work here. Massey Dialogues are based on the idea that to serve the public good, we need to build bridges. We need to build bridges between cultures, we need to build bridges between disciplines, and we need to build bridges between generations. So it has been constructed on the idea that we will be have a conversation with a great leader, Nurjehan Mawani, who's going to speak about her experience in Afghanistan when she was the special envoy of the Aga Khan. And then we will be joined by Junior Fellow Leah Morris, who will talk a little bit about what this work means to her in her research and her future possibility. And I will be joined as well by Matthew Fisher, a journalist who was one of the Southern Journalism Fellows at Massey a few years back. So this is the point, the idea of the Massey Dialogue is that we will talk among ourselves, but we also want to have questions from the audience. So on the side of your screen, you can type in your questions, and I will be happy to transmit them to our guest as we go along. So let me first introduce our guest speaker, Nurjehan Mawani. She has had a very distinguished career in Canada's civil service. She was the chair of Canada's Immigration and Refugee Board. That's when I met her. And she was also one of the heads of the Public Service Commission. She has the Order of Canada, and she went to Afghanistan as the special envoy for the Aga Khan. And in 2018, when she received an honorary doctorate from the American University of Afghanistan for her work there, they described it as transformational. So I can't wait to hear from her. I will also discuss her experience with one of our junior fellow, Leah Morris. Leah has worked with vulnerable populations throughout the world in Kingston, Jamaica, where she established a mobile health program with the Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition. She's been active in Canada on HIV/AIDS legal network, and she also worked with the United Nations migration agencies in the Migration, Environment and Climate Change Division, and had a fellowship with the Open Society Foundation in Johannesburg, South Africa. She's at the Monk Center, and she's working on information and communication technology issues and HIV interventions. Welcome to, it's such a lovely to have Leah on the program. She's a great member of the Junior Fellowship at Massey. And finally, we will be joined by journalist Matthew Fisher. Matthew Fisher is Post-Media International Affairs columnist. He's one of the longest serving foreign correspondent in Canada. He's lived over 30 years in Europe, Middle East, the Far East, and 6 years in Afghanistan. And he has witnessed more than 19 wars and conflict, and certainly will be here talking about his experience with us. We're delighted. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for all of you for being here. So I'll start with Nurjehan a little bit about asking you why you took that mandate and what was the mandate? How did you start thinking about going to Afghanistan?
Thank you very much, Natalie, to you and to Massey College for including me in this dialogue and so much relate to the mission of Massey College, which you have so eloquently described. So my connection with Afghanistan actually started right here in Canada. And that was in the early 90s. I was the chair of the Immigration and Refugee Board, and we began to see the Afghan refugee claimants coming in, fleeing persecution, a civil war, and then subsequently the Taliban period, And it was in those testimonies before us in the hearing room that we began to really understand what was going on. And particularly the violence that was being endured and inflicted upon women, and so many heads of households who were women and with no protection. And yet through those stories and that testimony, what became so evident was the incredible courage and resilience that was inherent in the way in which the claimants were approaching their lives and their futures, and there was always a sense of hope. So my connection started very early on. And then I was in, when this opportunity came up in 2013, I was already in Kyrgyzstan. I was representing the Aga Khan and the Aga Khan Development Network there, and two or three things right away. One was that there was an understanding that we were looking at a regional context, and that the stability or instability in Afghanistan was going to have an impact, and vice versa. There was going to be prosperity, the whole region was going to benefit. I myself had been in Kyrgyzstan through a very unstable period, revolutions, ethnic conflicts, but then had actually seen the transition to peace and stability. And I had learned about the importance of long-term commitment, the importance of supporting critical human resource building, institutional strengthening, and I had also learned about the importance of staying the course.
So when you arrived in Afghanistan, what exactly did you have? What was your mandate? What did you have to do? What did the Aga Khan imagine you could do?
So when I went to Afghanistan, the Aga Khan Development Network had already been quite active. The AKDN had been present through the 90s, through the humanitarian phase, civil war, Taliban period, and then in 2001, after the fall of the Taliban, had entered into an agreement of development cooperation. So there was already a strong sort of legal basis for the work that was going to be done in the reconstruction and development phase. And so when I went, there was already a strong presence of the Aga Khan Development Network and its agencies had started. So my role was to really build on that. There was an expansion of the programs, strengthening relationships, building on relationships with government and international partners, but also very important, strengthening civil society and working with civil society.
So how do you go about trying to strengthen civil society? Were you concerned, and I know your concerns about women as always been present throughout your life. Was that an issue that came up while you were there? And were there abilities to actually do some good work on that issue?
Very much so. I mean, one of the things that that has changed in Afghanistan over the last 18 years, among the many things that have changed, but just on the civil society front, that there was the emergence of a robust civil society. It's taken time, but the voices of civil society have become very present. And what was needed was to support the development of civil society and civil society institutions. Now, how it was done through accreditation, it was done through learnings and from other contexts. So there was a number of ways in which this happened, and women began to play a very important role, voices of women in civil society, strong media. So there was quite a lot of changes that were happening already, and which we had played a role in.
Before we go to the assessment as to what's left to be done for Afghanistan, I want to bring in Leah on this, because Leah, as I've explained, has worked around the world in pretty difficult circumstances. Any idea, any inspirations that you talk about the work of the Aga Khan on strengthening civil society? Has it been an issue that you've seen elsewhere in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So more recently, I was doing work in India, more in Delhi area. And the Aga Khan Foundation, they're actually doing a lot of great work with transgender women as well, who we know during a lot of these crises are not always included in the bubble of women and in a lot of women's programming. So I think across the world, women's voices is something that we want to start hearing, and we want to start including transgender women in the definition of women. And that's just something that I've seen. And I think across civil society, it's becoming more of a concept that people are familiar with. Thanks.
Well, it must have been quite the challenge to start this work around the world. Is that where you're going to be? Is that something that you want to work on in your work through your studies? Yeah,
so it's all a bit disconnected because I actually started in HIV and AIDS work, and so that took me across into multiple of the locations you said, mostly in Kingston, Jamaica, and from there, I've done different work in terms of LGBT work in South Africa and doing more environment and migration with the United Nations. So I'm definitely a global thinker, and I definitely think this world, you can't really solve any problems in a regional or local context. It's so connected, and we have so much influence on each other that it's very difficult to have a very localized career anymore. So I think thinking about the implications of what you're doing at a global level will happen for most people and most disciplines leaving into the workplace right now.
So that's your point. So you would look to Nur Jahan to give you some advice as to how do you get to have such a influential position in. So let's bring in Matthew here. 6 years in Afghanistan. Is that what you saw as well, the resilience?
It was really extraordinary what these people have been through. When I first went to Afghanistan in the spring of 2002 to Kandahar, just after the Taliban had been sent running, but Mullah Omar was still around, bin Laden was still up in the mountains.
Well, I think the connection may be difficult for Matthew here, so let's pick it up. I'm sure he's going to reconnect. So Nurjehan, what were your assessment?
So when
yeah, come back out. I'm glad that you're back. Yeah.
And you'd see all kinds of graffiti on the walls from the Russians, and it reminded you that these people had been dealing with big powers intervening and trying to bend Afghans to their way for a long time. And when you went to the cemeteries in Kabul, up in the hills around there, you can see all the British soldiers that died in the 19th century. In fact, there's epic British poetry about the British armies that fought and died there. And the Afghans have put up with this in various guises and faced different political philosophies. But at the end of it, there was always a gun somewhere in the process. And so the people have suffered terribly. There is no Afghan you can doesn't have many relatives who've died. And that's what struck me then. And it strikes me now equally, the tremendous number of Afghans who are still dying. When I think of the Afghan security forces, their death rate is so much higher than anything NATO faced or anything certainly the Canadian military faced, and it's forgotten. We don't know that literally thousands of Afghans fighting for a better Afghanistan are dying every month. And all of these people have families who depend on them for money and support. The Afghan family unit through all of this remains quite cohesive, but they've all suffered terribly, and yet they endure, and yet they go forward. And most Afghans still think that there will be peace at some point, and that's what they want.
So Nurjehan, let's bring you back in here. So what was your assessment? So you left the region. You're back in Canada. What was your assessment in terms of the possibility for peace, or the timeline for peace, which is really the big question?
So I want to echo what Matthew has said about that. all Afghans, almost every Afghan family has suffered and has lost somebody dear, and that the impulse for peace is very strong. I mean, just over the years that I've been there, and I'm sure Matthew can speak to that too, is that we have seen this really overwhelming impulse for peace. And it's not just in Kabul and urban centers. I've had the privilege of being able to travel. And as I've traveled, this has become very palpable, and particularly among women that I have encountered. Women have always been, in fact, have suffered disproportionately, we know, from conflict and from all of the other tragedies that surround a population. And so there is this impulse for peace. What I've also found is that there's a tremendous consciousness that peace cannot come at any price, and that the gains that have been made, particularly in women's education, indicate women's health, in women's economic empowerment, in women's political participation, in the economy, and that those have to be safeguarded. It's a very unique situation. I mean, I think we all know the statistics around the number of girls who are now in school. We know about the health indicators, maternal and mortality, which was among the highest in the world, and how that has come down. And I think we can take some sense of satisfaction as Canadians that we have played a role in this, working with agencies, including the Aga Khan network, but others too. What has been, for me, so inspiring is that we have women now at the table. We have women's voices at the table. From a time of 18 years ago when there were no girls in school, to women now at the talks in Oslo, and the talks in Doha, in the talks in Moscow, and now as part of the negotiating team. This is huge. And sitting here, sometimes we become impatient because we think, investment of blood and treasure and over so many years, and where is it all gone, and is it worth it? And I would say to you that just if we focus on those incredible strides that have been made, it's very inspiring, and we need to be there. We need to be there to continue supporting.
So would that be fair to say that these gains are vulnerable? And if, Leah has seen elsewhere where gains have been, have disappeared, and then you have to start all over again. And Matthew, do you see that there's some challenges in ensuring that the gains for women's empowerment, women's equality are maintained? Let's start with Leah, and then I'll get to Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. I think something that we need to also talk about, we had a bit of a pre-conversation for everyone watching about COVID. And I think bringing COVID into this is a really important discussion right now, especially because we know, as you said, that women often take the brunt of a lot of these conflicts, but also disaster situations, and talking about the rise in domestic abuse and how this disproportionately falls on women. And in the context of Afghanistan, I'm actually really wondering what you think about, you speak a lot of critical resource building and staying the course, and what does that really mean given the current circumstances?
So what about you, Matthew, before I get back to Nurjehan?
Well, as a male, you are blocked off from talking as women can to Afghan women in most cases. The educated people in Kabul, certainly there are quite a few women you can talk to, but outside of Kabul and in a very, very conservative town such as Kandahar, or also in the south, another conservative place, Herat, very hard to speak with women. But I don't think Canadians understand how much the Canadians tried in Kandahar to get women, girls, into the schools. When the Canadians built schools, This was during the Harper years, but when schools were built, it was a 50-50 proposition all the time. That was the idea. But the gains have been lost. Even then, they were starting to be lost because parents, fathers, did not want their daughters to be educated in many cases. And these schools became a place where you could be attacked. Another area that Canada, I think, has helped out a lot with is policing with women. Canada brought over the years dozens and dozens of policemen from a variety of forces, and I went out with a woman from the Montreal police force. I forget her last name, but her first name was Annie, and she was an absolutely wonderful woman. And she did everything she could to work with Afghan women police officers who were being killed at a very high rate. Now, it must also be said lots of Afghan male policemen were being killed too, but she was very brave and extremely dedicated. She said it was as if, almost like speaking to a nun or a priest, I found my vocation. It's not really being a traditional peace officer, but helping these people. And so in small ways, Canada's helped, but what I fear right now is a lot of that is being lost. The peace initiative, for example, the American one, totally excluded the Afghans from the process. How can you have a peace process with the Taliban where Afghans are not properly represented and are not equal partners? But that is how the Americans organized this construct, and that is what came out. And that's an example of things sliding back. You know, those first few years, it was all this propaganda from the Canadian and American military. There's a Pushtu word for it, a Dari word for it, about standing shoulder to shoulder with the Afghan people. Well, it's a lovely expression, and for some time that was true. But when we get to talking about peace, the Afghans literally were pushed out of the room while the Americans and the Taliban discussed peace. And to me, this is a very much slippage, if you like.
What's your view of this, Nur Jahan?
I mean, I think that I'd like to go back to this my original point about the impulse for peace, because it is truly overwhelming. And I think it is going to be a bumpy road. I mean, I don't think that one can expect, in a way, Matthew, if I were to respond to your point, it is going to be a bumpy road. And I think Afghans themselves are going to have to come and to find the solutions to this. And they will. I think that if left to their own devices, they will be able to find the solution. And there are, as we say in the AKDN, there are no Nescafe solutions. And there is going to need to be a longer term commitment, because even if there is a peace agreement, and I won't say even if, when a peace agreement is signed, how can that peace be sustained? That's the bigger question now. I think that's going to be very important. And that's where we need to start thinking. We already are. I know Canada, the AKDN, and other international communities already thinking about that, working with the Afghan government and civil society and political parties as to what that might look like and where those investments are needed. So, I mean, if you were to ask me, I would say, this is at least my perspective, is that we need to continue investing in girls' education. We need to continue investing in health. I mean, look, we've seen the potential of COVID just washing away all the gains that have been made, not in so many situations. So any strategy around COVID has to be taking that into account. And if we don't, and then I would say we need to focus on, at the macro level, I mean, there will be continued probably instability in terms of political instability, but at the micro level is what I think we have to focus on. And that's at the level of community engagement. We have learned this over sort of 50 years as a network of working in development. And that's where I have seen personally traveling, visiting, meeting the the trust, the building of trust, the building of confidence, but very important that we've been able to have changes take root much more quickly at the local level. And that's where women get involved.
That's it. But that's the issue, isn't it? Is to see return on the investment in a way that kind of sustains the appetite back in Canada, back elsewhere, to continue to invest there where there will be needs all around the world and in many other areas. So how do we convince people that it's a good investment and it's the right investment and that it's worth doing and it's worth prioritizing? That's the issue. Is why is Afghanistan continue to be a priority? Should it be a priority? And how do we move forward on the Canadian level? Leah, any ideas on this if we were to ask you? Compared to your other big projects that you've had,
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a big question. If we had the answer to it, then we would not be in the circumstances that we are. So I have no brilliant solution. I think that given the current circumstances, it's been mentioned, and we can all see that supply chains are global. We can see that no matter where you are in the world, things are connected. And so I think it is important that we start to understand how the livelihood of a woman in Afghanistan might be connected to your own. And so being able to see this global connection, I think, really helps people to understand what is happening in the world. And I think there might, in my own opinion, on post-COVID, be some ability to decrease costs where we don't necessarily need them. I think in the development context, there's a lot of flying to places for a lot of voluntourism and other things that don't necessarily need to happen. So I think that you might also see some efficiencies start to crop up, which could be really, really good. And that doesn't answer the question, but I do think that is something that will happen. Yeah, I think it's something that will happen over time. But I'd love to hear what some of the others have to think on this topic.
So what about you, Matthew? What do you see? Did you see a sustained Canadian interest in Afghanistan?
I think it's going to be very hard to sustain that interest. I agree with Nur Jahan that the will for peace in Afghanistan on the part of the people is overwhelming. It's a difficult country to do accurate polling in, but just anecdotally, it has to be at 90% or something like that. I mean, it's off the charts high, although it's hard to measure, to quantify. But there will be such competition for money. And with governments, the Canadian government this year and next year may have $400 billion of debt. Other countries are facing similar situations. I think there will be a great debate about foreign aid. There will be a great debate about whether Canada needs the military that it has today. And I'm an advocate for that, but I can see how difficult that is going to be. And when I speak to people, diplomats with experience in Pakistan and Afghanistan and the region, they bring this up all the time in the past few weeks, that this will be a very tough sell, not just Afghanistan, but keeping all of these humanitarian issues at the forefront when right now people are concerned literally with their own lives, unemployment, giving your $10 or $50 donation. It's all going to go. So I think it's a very tough sell. It's extremely worthwhile. I think what you get back from it is tremendous. But I'm sure all of the aid agencies and foundations are aware that it's a steep hill that they've got to climb in the next.
But what about Leah's argument, which is, didn't COVID demonstrate the interdependencies and the fast-moving aspect of a virus that is not curtailed somewhere and then speeds and creates havoc everywhere? So it's an interesting dilemma that we recognize the interdependency, but our reflexes to,
Our reflexes are nationalistic today. We see this even about the squabbles over, important squabbles over who gets masks, who gets protection gear. The supply chains are global. Everything is global. But now that is kind of fractured, and going forward, a lot of people will be in a protectionist frame of mind, and a lot of people in Canada, I think, will question foreign aid. And we have not done a good job on foreign aid in the past few years. The Harper government cut foreign aid, and then the Trudeau government on top of that cut foreign aid. The Harper government talks a good game about military. In my opinion, they never really come through. Well, the Trudeau government talks a great game on humanitarian aid and then doesn't really come through. And so that, I think they are linked, the supply chain and whatnot, but people are going to think for themselves and be very selfish the next couple of years. And that is extremely unfortunate for people in Afghanistan.
Well, so what we have to hear your response, Nur Jahan, about what are you back here to try to convince us that there's a better way than becoming selfish?
Well, you know, I think I've been so inspired by, notwithstanding the focus inward initially about the focus, the caremongering Canadians, the stories around that. I have a hard time believing that we will not reach out. I think it's, we now just recently were recognized, Canada was recognized as the moral leader of the world. I mean, you know, I'm thinking about how a little while ago when everybody would be looking for being in the Fortune 500, but to be a moral leader would be considered very almost I don't know, cheesy, but it is now important. It is now important. Now, going back to Afghanistan, I would say that we have made such a lot of investments, the blood and treasure already in Afghanistan, and we went in, yes, as part of the coalition, but women's I would say liberation of women, we could even call it that, and the empowerment of women was a very important aspect. And we have played, as Canada, a really, I think, very important role in this. And ultimately, if we are looking for global peace and security, and this interconnected world that Leah has talked about, and which we all know, we have just seen that, it's also in the context of terrorism. It's also, which Matthew knows more about, but it is in this context that we are no longer able to say what happens in a distant country really doesn't matter because we are going to be protected. And so I would say that we need to focus on that. I will give you a couple of statistics. 63.7% of the Afghan population is under the age of 25. Now, you can look at it both ways. You can say that's huge, you know, and half of that is male. And we also know what the risks are if that population, that cohort is not included in any development and doesn't. But equally, when we see that that has huge potential, and when you couple that with the resilience, the resourcefulness, the thirst for education, I have never seen anything like this. And I have traveled, I have never seen women in burqas in Faizabad at a microcredit bank where I've been talking to them to say, what are you saving for? Little pots money from their little businesses. And they said to me, for my child's education. It has, so when I put the combination of all of this, we have a lot to learn. We have so much to learn from countries, especially that have dealt with conflict and that are dealing with conflict on a day-to-day basis. I mean, we feel confined because we are in our home and we can't go out and we can't talk to anyone. And I'm part of that. But immediately I think of people who have had to do that all the time for long periods of time, and not because of COVID, right? This is an additional. So I think that we need to tell the stories. And maybe we don't do a good enough job I often feel that we can do much better in terms of explaining to Canadians, look where your investments are going, what changes have happened, and why you must continue those investments, particularly in women and girls.
Well, that's a good time to bring Leah in on this issue, because do you see in your cohort, in your age cohort, a different assessment of the necessity for foreign aid, or a different sense of global interdependency, global interconnectedness? You're at Monk, so obviously you may speak to a group that is particularly connected on this issue, but do you see that there's a generational difference here?
I think there is a generational difference. We do certainly have people able to connect all over the world via things like TikTok or any kind of platform that allows us to connect. But I'm not sure that there is still any more critical thinking about that. I think there's still just a convenience in terms of, there's, like I talked about, there's a lot of volunteerism. There's a lot of boosting our resumes here in North America by being able to go to some of these different countries that are not our own, and we are able to go and do research projects and come back. And I think that isn't always done consciously, and I don't think that's a generational thing. I think that's something that's been happening forever. Unfortunately, with women, I don't think things are getting better, but there's still huge discrepancies. I'm also in the MBA, and I think our program is only 1/3 women. And specifically, I've been looking at going into some of the more financial routes, and you see in venture capitalism and the entrepreneurship space, so few women. And I think women account for 36% of analysts in the venture capital world, and then only 13.5% of all partners are female, and then 8.9% of management partners. So when you start looking at, we talk about investments, and you start looking at who controls the money and where these startups, and we talk about microfinance, but who actually has control to money and who is able to make investments and change their communities. And we're talking either small startups or big startups. Men still hold a lot of that money. And to speak on the binary, that's the way we do the research in it. But what has been said really impacts me in terms of the fact that things have changed, at least in narrative. But I'm not sure the money is flowing to new places, if I can summarize that way. So thanks.
So, but when you get to have control of the money, or when your generation, or I hope you personally, but your generation as well, do you see that there will be some changes? Is there some systemic changes in the way people comprehend their responsibility, their ethical responsibility, their connection to the world?
Of course, I want to say yes, but I don't have the research on it. I do think that there is some research that shows that products only sell now when you have some kind of ethical connection. But are we teaching critical thinking? So I can want to support environmental causes all I want, but greenwashing is still massive. So if I tell you that it's environmentally friendly, will you just buy it, or are you actually thinking through what that looks like? And I think there is a desire for people. I think people genuinely do want to help and do the best that they can, but I'm not sure we always have the tools to be able to do that. And sometimes those tools are intentionally taken away from us. So more than just educating women, I think globally, it's giving people the tools to be able to critically think, to be able to have the information, looking at who has access to information, who has access to knowledge, and who has the ability to use that knowledge and act on it. That's what really matters. And so I think the next generation, I think every generation has wanted to do the right thing, but knowing what that is a privilege, I would say.
Well, that brings in the journalist should have an opinion on this. You know, you've been a foreign correspondent for many years, being able to write all these stories. But do you feel you're a dying breed there about when newspapers are not investing as much in?
Well, I'm a dinosaur. I am a walking dinosaur. I'm a relic of the past, because nobody really, I did, if you like, frontline journalism in war zones, conflict zones, most of the time. Almost nobody, certainly in Canada, does that kind of work before. And the problem for countries such as Afghanistan is, of course, I think, that it is hugely important that there be journalists there with many different points of view, but to study these things. My particular thing was security issues. But journalism is a very big church, if you like, and there's a lot of space for every kind of journalism. I know people who are interested in journalism in terms of humanitarian aid strictly from a religious point of view. I know people who are interested in humanitarian aid from a feminist point of view. All of these views are valid. They're all sort of the potage. They're part of the soup that makes journalism. But there are also, if we want to talk about Afghanistan specifically, there are outside players still, malevolent outside players, influencing things. And as our interest in this area in terms of security recedes rather dramatically, and Canada was the first country, if you like, to cut and run from NATO, and many other countries did stay several years longer than Canada did. But Pakistan, I can remember having a conversation with Chris Alexander when he was Canada's ambassador before he took on a UN role in Afghanistan 12, 13 years ago, in which he said there's no solution to Afghanistan without Pakistan. And for every single issue, that's a factor. Now China is getting involved because of its mining interests there. Iran has always been stirring the pot. Britain has always said it has an interest there. Russia and the great game that was played with Britain for so long. All these things affect beyond these things, and you need journalists to talk about those things. Unfortunately, I know this is a bit off what you would like perhaps to talk about, but they're important, I think, to solving Afghanistan's problem.
Well, thank you for bringing this, and I have a question, I think, from the audience here that I want to share, and it's a question that says, British, Russians, now Americans, would it not better if all forces pulled out, is the question that's being asked. What do you think, Nur Jahan? Is that feasible for all forces to leave? What would it do?
Well, I think it's premature, and it's going to be. And I think any withdrawal is a condition-based withdrawal. That is, I think, what is has been discussed, and as far as I know, that's what has been agreed. So we should, I'm with Matthew that completely without any military support or any, I think it's going to be very difficult for the next while. Afghan security forces are becoming stronger. We have seen that. They've been with the training and the support and so I think it's a question of ultimately handing over to the Afghan security forces. That is the plan, but I think that there is a phased approach in this.
I take it that's probably your view, Matthew, on this, or?
It is, but the Afghan forces have a huge attrition rate. They leave the force in very large numbers, which means you're constantly having to retrain them. And one of the reasons is because they've taken on more and more dangerous tasks, and staggering numbers of them have died. And this has consequences not only for the security framework, but also for the political and social fabric of the country, because every one of these people have family who depend on them for money and well, just simply the family unit. And I think you must keep some kind of security component. The Taliban, every time you give them an inch, they take a mile. And in the last couple of months, the number of attacks have risen spectacularly once again. Great numbers of civilian casualties. When you talk of peace and the Taliban comes to the peace table, that does not stop them prosecuting their war. And I do not believe most Afghans want the kind of future with a caliphate. They're very proud to be Muslims. They're extremely proud to be Islamic. But that does not at all mean that most of them want anything to do with the Taliban. And I think that's something sometimes people in the West forget when they try to lump things together. And this is a problem going forward because the Taliban could be the big winners and the Afghan people do not want that. And in terms of women's issues, For example, if the Taliban are back in the cockpit running things, it will not be good for Afghan women and Afghan children at all.
So, Nur Jahan, is this fear of going backwards with an increased presence of the Taliban, was that palpable? Is that something that even the Aga Khan's network is concerned about?
Well, I'm going to speak on my sort of own account here, but there is fear that this could happen, but this could happen, but equally, there is therefore a kind of a building almost of a coalition or against so that it doesn't happen. So sometimes when you identify a risk and you know what gains have been made and you're not prepared to allow those to slide. And I think ultimately, Afghans will have a decision to make at the ballot box, because if the trajectory goes the way that it is expected, then the Taliban will be opening their offices. They will become part of the political process, and that Afghans will have an opportunity to decide and to be able to do this at the ballot box. I mean, one of the things that we have been talking about earlier, and I don't know if you will allow me, but we've been talking a lot about funds and about the appetite for more funding. I think one area we need to really also remind ourselves is that Canada can contribute in many other ways. And I'm thinking in terms of knowledge, in terms of technology, in terms of what is happening. So I think it's really important, Canadian lessons in pluralism. I think we need to broaden the whole discourse around the Canadian role and Canada's contribution, frankly, to the world, but in this particular context in Afghanistan. And I mean, I'm very proud, I think you will be if you know, that in Afghanistan, telemedicine was introduced in 2007. I was visiting Afghanistan at the time. And, when I had my consultation with my doctor here in Vancouver 3 weeks ago through remote live, so I said to her, but doctor, we were doing this in 2007 in Afghanistan. And she couldn't, that brought home, now why did that happen? There was a convergence, there was a need to reach out to populations that would otherwise not be possible for them to have. And so there was a need, and there was a convergence between sort of medicine, science, technology, and collaboration. And it was a Canadian couple that I want to really give a shout to. Karim and Shainur Koja, who were really involved in Roshan, which is part of the network, in bringing Cisco and in looking at how this could be done, working with the French Medical Institute for Children, the Aga Khan University, and there we were, and how that program has grown, and so it's possible, and we've seen. Look at these Afghan robotics team, the girls team. You're looking at the MIT blueprint and working away at their end. These are all the things we have to encourage because they are there.
And what a great example of knowing that when you give something, then eventually it comes back to help you. Certainly, I think we all will need more telemedicine. I see that there's another question coming on. So would not PRC be the best to liberate women of Afghanistan? They share a border. That is rationale they have for occupying Tibet. The People's Republic of China. Sorry, I couldn't read the. So this is a kind of a bizarre question of whether China would be a better protector.
I hope the questioner is being facetious. I assume that it must be a somewhat facetious question because China is not engaged on any progressive issues that I am aware of. It's one of the reasons that there was initial friction between the Trudeau government and the Chinese when the trade deal foundered 3 or 4 years ago. This is before the two Michaels, before Ms. Meng and Huawei and whatnot. So I don't see this. The Chinese interest will be simply money and resources.
What about you, Leah? Nur Jahan was commenting a little bit on situating the transfer of technology, the way in which we are, a technological transformation can actually have lots of impact, both in developing countries, but throughout the world. Is that the future? Is that what young people think will be the solution?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that especially when we look at things like robotics, like artificial intelligence, it's going to have massive impacts globally. And making sure that that technology is developed from a government or from an institution that cares about human rights frameworks and cares about privacy frameworks will be really important. So I'm really actually excited to hear about the excitement around having development move towards technological feats. I think this is huge. And I think the telemedicine example is a brilliant example of that. And I think that as we move forward, I'd actually be very curious to know what Nur Jahan thinks about artificial intelligence. I know that trying to speed up refugee through the IRB, we're trying to introduce artificial intelligence to speed up that process, but there's massive human rights concerns and there's massive biases concerns. And how do we introduce technology that could potentially have massive impacts for the betterment of humanity, while also balancing some of the risks and challenges that come with frameworks around privacy and security and ensuring that we don't sacrifice those for efficiency?
Did you get the question, Nur Jahan? I know that the junior fellows have been asking about this. Will AI be a way, will artificial intelligence be a way of speeding the process of determining refugee eligibility or immigration access and so on? Can they replace the hearing by a good AI program?
I think it's about balance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about being vigilant. It's looking at the opportunity and the efficiency and to balance it with the risk and to really be vigilant and to examine that very carefully. I'm not sure that we are at that point yet that that assessment has been fully completed. But I think even after monitoring the impact, monitoring always is going to be crucial. I mean, I do worry about the fact that, and we are seeing the National Democratic Institute in the US has come out with a good, I think, a very salutary reminder that there is a tendency when situations of crisis emerge for certain governments and for others, particularly governments in certain places, to start to take on a much more authoritarian sort of role. And that's where civil society comes in. That's where we have to stand. You, Massey College, Leah, you're the younger generation. I'm always saying this to my son and daughter that, this is your future. So you have to be, the young people have to be engaged and be concerned with what sort of world you want to have for you and your children. Become stewards of that world, help to shape that world.
Well, we're coming to the end a little bit, so I'm going to let Matthew, what concluding remarks that you'd like to share with the Massey community here on this Afghan subject?
I enjoy and impressed by the great enthusiasm for Afghanistan. I share it, but I am also more cynical about the future of Afghanistan. It has endured so much, and I don't think its suffering is over. I don't think it is enough that 90% of the population want peace. If somebody comes with a gun and you don't have one in a place like that where there is no rule of law, where there isn't really an established procedure for dealing with these things. It's bad. But on the plus side, I saw what Roshan did in the early days there, and Canadians were heavily involved with Roshan, just simply in establishing the network. They leapt a whole generation. They didn't use landlines. They went right to cell telephones, and they went to, at that time, what you could do with the cell telephone. You can do a lot more with it now. But Afghans embraced that technology everywhere in the country. And where those cell phone towers went, they did a great job. There are other areas that Canada can help that do not require huge money. One is in agriculture, through helping with seeds and irrigation, planning irrigation systems for saffron, for pomegranate, for grapes, all of this. An elephant in the room we haven't discussed here today is the drug trade from Afghanistan, which is a huge problem. But all of these things are at play. There is reason to be optimistic about quite a few things. I just think money is going to be awful tight the next couple of years. And Afghanistan and many similar countries in terms of being poor are going to be, unfortunately, in a very tough spot, maybe tougher a spot than they were in before. That's unfortunately my dark read of it, if you like.
So Leah, what about you? Any comments to the audience before we go to the thanks? What does that, kind of sobering thoughts here bring to mind for the future of your work?
Yeah. So I just want to thank you all for having this conversation, and I think it is very interesting to have these conversations, especially along intergenerational lines. I think sometimes we do talk about the younger generation, and it's our responsibility to get it sorted. But I do think we need to not just accept that younger generations are who should figure it out. And I think that we should all be part of this and think as people, what do we want the future to look like for Canada and for Afghanistan and for countries all around the world? So I think part of that interdisciplinary piece is throwing it back to you to also be able to think about this as a collective, not in generational boxes. So I think that's a really important piece, and I'm really glad that we've had this dialogue. It isn't my specific area of focus, so I've learned a lot through this dialogue, and it's been really great to be able to hear the thoughts of both Matthew and Nur Jahan. So thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure.
Nur Jahan, final thoughts,
If I may, I have to just come in and pick up Leah's point, because I think that's a very fair point. It is collective. It's a collective and a shared responsibility. The reason why I'm talking about the new generation, as we call it in Afghanistan, and the younger generation, is because, frankly, we have messed up. In many ways. Look at the leadership, the generation. So I'm looking forward, where maybe I'm at the stage now where I'm really looking forward to being there, to be there, to support with experience and all of this, but the ideas are coming from you now. I think that's going to be important. And colleges like Massey College, with the work in interdisciplinary, in critical thinking, all of those are now going to be particularly important. Collaboration across disciplines, all of that. So I think we are entering a really, it's a very interesting phase. There are both opportunities and there are risks. And I'm going to suggest that we focus now very much on the opportunities for us domestically in Canada, but even more importantly to me, is that we focus on the role Canada can play.
Well, that's a good final comment, because I was going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that have percolated since we started Massey Dialogues about other thematics that should be addressed. Particularly the foreign policy of Canada, I think, has been raised many times, that we need to have new dialogues and new thinking and reflect on that. And the drug policy and the elephant in the room about the impact of illegal drugs throughout the world. But I just want to conclude by thanking you so much for being on the program. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you very much, Nur Jahan, for joining us from Vancouver. It's a real pleasure to have you. I hope that we're going to be connecting again. I hope that eventually we might be even in the same room as opposed to just virtually connecting. So I also want to thank the people behind the scene at Massey that are at home but working for Massey College, Matthew Glenfield and Abra Risi, who are behind helping the Massey dialogues to take shape and to take form. Tomorrow, audience, we will have Her Excellency, the Right Honorable Julie Payette, to come to the program at noon, so please join us. And on Thursday afternoon at 5 o'clock, we're going to talk about the future of publishing and books with John McFarlane and Aaron Siddiqui and some junior fellows, Apala Das as well. So please join us and continue to be part of this intergenerational dialogues.
Thank you.